This time on Crime Inc. Glam rockers fall from grace. The assassination of Martin Luther King. A London woman murders her husband's lover. Hospital's angel of death kills 4 babies. And an Australian drug smuggler goes to the gallows in Singapore. But first, the Bhopal disaster. The rusty spires of the Union Carbide pesticide plant overshadow the Indian town of Bhopal. And since a catastrophic chemical spill, the plant has lain idle, a ghostly reminder of the world's worst industrial accident. The problem became apparent in the early hours of December the 3rd, 1984, when large amounts of toxic gas escaped the plant after water entered one of the tanks. Workers fled the compound, but Union Carbide had no emergency plan in place to protect the densely populated neighboring town. When the sun rose the next morning, thousands of bodies lined the streets. The official estimate was 4,000 dead. However, authorities dumped thousands of bodies in the Armada River, and independent agencies believe more than 8,000 people perished in the disaster. 500,000 people were exposed to the toxic chemicals. Thousands of survivors have suffered severe health effects and died from related illnesses in the years since. From the beginning, American company Union Carbide distanced itself from the spill, claiming the plant was independently run by an Indian version of the company, and thus it could not be held accountable for any safety shortcomings. And there was no lack of those. One former safety officer told the BBC he had resigned from his position with Union Carbide because he was so dissatisfied with the company's response to his complaints on how the plant was being run. Another senior engineer said safety standards at the plant were so poor, he believed it should have been shut down. However, Union Carbide denied the leak occurred because of substandard operations and produced a report from an engineering consulting firm that stated that water had entered the tank because of a deliberate act of sabotage. Meanwhile, Bhopal residents demanded that someone be brought to account for the accident and called on the Indian government to lay charges. The Bhopal Gas Leak Act was passed in March 1985, allowing the government to act on the victim's behalf, and court action was launched.
Laws are very strict, but we do not have skilled people in sufficient number and with skills to inspect the system as required. Secondly, is many times very costly or expensive sophisticated equipment are operated and managed by people who do not have training or skills for the same. And this may result in sometimes unexpected behavior of these equipment.
Despite being assured that he would not face criminal sanctions, Union Carbide's American boss, Warren Anderson, was arrested and charged with manslaughter when he arrived in Bhopal a few days after the disaster. He was released on bail and fled back to the United States. He has never returned to India, where a warrant remains for his arrest. The Indian government has not pressed for his extradition. On the anniversary of the tragedy every year, survivors burn effigies of Anderson and Indian politicians to express their anger at the slow pace of justice. Union Carbide settled out of court with the Indian government in 1999, agreeing to pay damages of $407 million. Those who lost family members received an average of $2,000 each. But there is still no agreement over who will pay for the cleanup. Bhopal remains dangerously polluted with mercury, lead and chloroform among the toxic cocktails still present in deadly quantities. Multinational company Dow Chemical absorbed Union Carbide in 2001, but refuses to take responsibility for future payouts. In the 1970s, glam rocker Gary Glitter stalked the stage in silver platform boots and a selection of glitter suits. But by the first decade of the next century, his stock had plummeted, following convictions for child pornography and sex with underage girls. When he was discovered living in Cambodia in 2002, the Minister for Women's Affairs said sex offenders were not welcome in her country and that she planned to have him deported.
As soon as I received his dossier from the British Embassy, I will look with our legal team, our lawyer, and look at the legal aspect of it. He has not committed a crime in Cambodia. I understand that. But out of moral concern, as a preventive measure, I will move forward to address the issue, take it upward to the Prime Minister, and my suggestion to the Prime Minister would be to ask for his deportation.
Glitter duly moved on and relocated to Vietnam. But a few years later, he was hauled into court in 2006 to face child molestation charges. The 62-year-old said he expected to be released.
Are you confident?
Yes, I'm confident.
If you are released today, where will you go?
Have a beer.
Are your plans to go back to the UK?
Yes, of course.
He was convicted in Vietnam under his real name, Paul Francis Gadd, in a one-day closed trial. He was found guilty of molesting two 11-year-old girls in Vung Tau, a resort town about 120 kilometers from Ho Chi Minh City. This morning, Gary Glitter gave out 3 points for his defense. The first point, he said, that it is a conspiracy of the media working with so-called victims to get him. The second point was about evidence that the provincial court of Vung Tau used to accuse him. The third point, he said, he had nothing to do with the accusation of child sex abuse and that he was innocent. Throughout the reading of the decision, Glitter, dressed in black, stood facing the judge with his hands behind his back. He occasionally shook his head over the description of the evidence and the charges against him. At a press briefing after the hearing, a court official said the court considered evidence from Cambodia that Glitter had sexually molested children there, as well as his conviction in his home country of Britain of storing pornographic pictures of children on his personal computer. Glitter was convicted in Britain in 1999 of possessing child pornography and served half of a 4-month jail term. The charges were laid after a computer technician discovered more than 4,000 prohibited images on a computer Glitter had sent in for repair. The judge said the photos were filthy and revolting, and of the worst possible type. Glitter was also placed on the British Sex Offenders Register, but the rocker was cleared of separate charges that he assaulted a teenage fan in the 1970s. Vietnamese officials said that they had no doubt the conviction was fair. In a combination of the statement of the victims, witnesses, and investigation process, the investigative police proposed to sentence him for child molesting, and that is absolutely a right decision. Although Glitter maintained his innocence and accused British tabloid newspapers of conspiring against him, he paid $2,000 compensation to the 2 girls and their families. Glitter is due for release shortly and is likely to be deported from Vietnam after he leaves jail. Coming up, the murder of Martin Luther King. He was a powerful orator, a charismatic leader, and one of the greatest Americans of all time. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led a revolution in the 1950s and 60s that ended racial segregation and brought civil rights to the forefront of the political agenda. But in 1968, aged 39, King was brutally felled by an assassin's bullet, and the American political landscape was changed forever. Only 24 when he became pastor at a Baptist church in Alabama, King quickly gained a reputation for being an agitator. He demanded justice in the racist South, where white supremacists murdered African Americans with impunity, confident that sympathetic police and juries would take their side. One of the most notorious cases was the 1963 bombing of a church in Birmingham, Alabama, that killed 4 black girls.
What murdered these 4 girls? Look around. You will see that many people that you never thought about participated this evil act. So tonight all of us must leave here with a bit of penitence, with a new determination to struggle.
King's struggle was strictly non-violent, in line with his profession as a man of God. Like Gandhi, he authorized only peaceful protests and campaigns of civil disobedience that proved extremely effective. The March on Washington in 1963 attracted more than 250,000 people of every race and color to demonstrate their support for civil rights. But not everyone supported the message of equality. Some civil rights workers were murdered and their homes and workplaces bombed. Despite this intimidation and a growing number of death threats, King continued to spread the word of racial equality, gathering more and more support for his cause. King himself went to prison many times.
Well, the jail experience is never an easy experience. The loneliness of jail, the frustration of jail, the lack of communication with outside always brings with it real problems. But I would say, in a real sense, that this was maybe a little better than some of the others I've had.
Let's make the speeches in some church someplace.
Glad to see you.
One person who hated the principles King stood for was convicted armed robber James Earl Ray. Ray came from a poor Midwest family and was well known for his hatred of black Americans. One of his brothers later said of him, "All his life Jimmy has been wild on two subjects. He's been wild against niggers and he's wild on politics. He's wild against any politician who's for niggers and he's wild for any politician who's against niggers. Nobody can reason with Jimmy on the two subjects of niggers and politics." Ray escaped from a Missouri prison in 1967 and spent time in Canada and Mexico before returning to the States. A subsequent FBI investigation established that he made a number of purchases that included a powerful rifle, false passports, and camera equipment. On the evening of April 3, 1968, King and his fellow workers were staying at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. The civil rights leader had just given a speech to members of the Church of God in Christ that came to be known as the I've Been to a Mountaintop address. It was to be the last time he appeared in public. At 6:01 p.m., King was standing on the motel's second-floor balcony when he was shot in the face by a single bullet. He was rushed to hospital, but doctors were unable to save him, pronouncing him dead an hour later. Witnesses described seeing a well-dressed white man abandon an automatic rifle and escape in a blue car. Police traced fingerprints on the rifle to James Earl Ray, and the fugitive became one of the FBI's most wanted criminals. He was traced to London and brought back to the United States for trial a few months later. Ray denied committing the murder, but was persuaded by his attorney to plead guilty in exchange for life in prison after it became apparent the prosecution would seek the death penalty, and the evidence made a conviction almost inevitable. Several people have argued Ray was the victim of a conspiracy that originated high in the echelons of power. However, no evidence has ever been revealed to confirm this. It appears more likely that Ray, with the possible support of one or more of his brothers, planned and executed the murder motivated by his hatred of black Americans, the desire to claim a bounty allegedly offered by two St. Louis businessmen. James Earl Ray spent the rest of his life in prison, apart from a short period in 1977, when he escaped and was on the run for 3 days before being recaptured. He died in 1998, aged 70. King's funeral was held in his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, but Governor Lester Maddox refused to close the state capitol to honor him and did not attend the funeral, dubbing him an enemy of the country. However, former First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, and presidential hopefuls Richard Nixon and Robert Kennedy were among the 100,000 mourners who followed the coffin on its route to Southview Cemetery. His grave is now part of the Martin Luther King Jr. Historic Site, a place of pilgrimage visited by thousands of people every year. This is the double-barrel shotgun that Rena Salmon used to kill her friend, Lorna Stewart. There was never any doubt that she committed the murder. The question for the jury was, did she intend to. Salmon took the shotgun out of her husband's gun cabinet on the 10th of September 2002. She then drove to Chiswick in West London on her way to confront Lorna Stewart, who was shacked up with Rena's husband Paul. As she walked, two electricians saw the gun and joked, "Don't shoot, love." She opened the door of the beauty salon. Her rival Lorna Stewart said, "So you've come to shoot me?" Salmon shot her twice, and while Stewart lay bleeding to death, calmly sent text messages to both her husband and her friend Leonie Griffin.
I got a text through from her saying, "I've shot Lorna." And I looked at the text, I couldn't believe it, and I texted her back and said, "Got to be joking. Well, this is a joke." And I didn't hear anything else, so I then phoned her a few minutes later and actually spoke to her, and she said that she'd shot Lorna once in the back and once in the side.
Salmon's defense said she was suffering from an abnormality of mind after being told about the relationship by Stewart's husband, Keith Rodriguez. The defense argued Salmon went to the salon with the intention of killing herself.
This is a case where the verdict should have been one of guilty of manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. 4 independent opinions have been rejected by the jury.
Inside the courtroom, Salmon described her mother as a prostitute who used to scrub her with bleach when she was a child.
The court has heard that Salmon may have had a disturbed childhood, but it was wrong for her to use this as a defence for the premeditated and cold-blooded murder of Lorna Stewart.
The jury deliberated just 4 hours before they found Rena Salmon guilty of murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with a 14-year minimum. Coming up, Nightmare in Ward 4. Nurse Kathy Smith knew there was something strange about Ward 4 at Gratham and Kesteven Hospital, where she worked alongside Beverly Allett. But it wasn't until later that she discovered her colleague was a cold-blooded killer.
The ward had an electric atmosphere almost, you know, every shift. It was as if something was going to happen. And on one of the occasions, I was stood outside a cubicle a few feet away from her, and she must have had her hand over a child's face, and she called me, a first-year student nurse, over to her, instead of a staff nurse on there at the time, who was no further away, but she just says, "Oh, Kathy, come here," and beckoned me over, and I went over smiling, thinking, oh, you know, the baby's just in his cot smiling, as I'd left him about 5–10 minutes before, and he wasn't breathing. You know, just thinking to have nightmares and nightmares about that. You know, I've been nursing a nightmare for 2 years.
Were you able to resuscitate the baby?
Yes, thankfully, but he's brain damaged.
Allett carried out her deadly rampage over 3 months in 1991, murdering 4 children and seriously injuring 9. She used various methods, including insulin and potassium overdoses. At her trial, it was revealed doctors believed she was suffering from Munchausen by proxy, a psychiatric disorder that leads people to inflict harm on others to gain attention for themselves. Allett was convicted in 1993 and given 13 life sentences, in order to serve a minimum of 30 years before she could be considered for release, one of the most severe sentences ever handed down to a woman in Britain. At the trial, Allett denied the charges, but has since admitted to 3 of the murders. The families of the affected children said they would never support her release.
I don't ever want her to come out, ever.
It's affected our lives too much already. We'll never forget what happened. If the day ever comes around where some high judge decides that she's going to be released, then we'll be behind everybody else, all the other parents, and saying that we will not allow that to happen.
Once the crime was revealed, Britain's health authorities came under the spotlight, and questions were asked about how Allett was able to injure so many babies.
Obviously, I was at a very junior level on the ward, and we had the closest contact with the children, and I just think it's the least that can be done. We know what happened with the children and everything like that, but anything higher up, I've no idea what was going on.
The public would want to know how Allett got employed in the first place, why the health authority did nothing about the trade union's complaints about staffing levels, why the staff received no support, why there was no communication with the staff when the investigation started, and why the staff received no support during the investigation, and why was the union forced to provide counselling for the staff who had come to the realisation they'd gone through this terrible tragedy?
Beverly Allett's parents were devastated by the case.
Richard and Lillian Allett ask me now to formally and publicly express their deepest sympathy to all those who are victims in any way in this case. They would wish to lend their support to the call that is being made at the highest level that any inquiry into Ward 4 at Grantham Hospital should be held in public.
An independent inquiry found that middle managers at the hospital had missed critical clues that would have alerted them to foul play. It also noted that it was a hospital operating on a shoestring budget and criticised sloppy appointments procedures that allowed Allett to be recruited.
We're never going to prevent a serial killer, and we have to make it very clear that to have a serial killer who is a female and who is a health service professional is extraordinarily rare. But obviously, if your staffing levels are sufficient, maybe she would have been witnessed. And certainly accidents and incidents like this, hopefully, certainly could have either been reduced or have been picked up certainly much more quickly.
Author Nick Davies wrote a book about the murders.
There's nothing special about Grantham Hospital. And the most worrying implication of this story is that all of these general hospitals around the country would collapse under any of these extra strains, whether it's a killer or a bomb or a pile-up. The hospitals are so underfunded and so demoralised they can't cope. And that's what must frighten Virginia Bottomley when she looks at this thing.
Meanwhile, Beverly Allett remains behind bars at a high-security facility. And in light of the horrific events that occurred there, the maternity unit at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital has been closed down. On a hot, humid Singapore night in December 2005, a group of people gathered outside Changi Prison to silently mark the execution of convicted drug trafficker Van Tuong Nguyen. 25-year-old Nguyen was born in a Thai refugee camp and came to Australia as a child with his Vietnamese mother and twin brother Dang Koa. After struggling with financial problems stemming from a failed business venture and crippling debts run up by his twin, Nguyen agreed to smuggle drugs from Cambodia to Australia. But while in transit at Changi Airport in Singapore, Nguyen set off a metal detector and was searched by security guards, who discovered a bag of heroin strapped to his body. The case was cut and dried, and Nguyen readily admitted his guilt. However, the fact that the Singaporean High Court sentenced the trafficker to death caused great consternation in Australia, where capital punishment has been prohibited since 1973. Some Singaporeans also opposed the execution.
But civil society all around the world who is watching this must learn from this lesson that we shall fight till the last moment. And that's the reason why we have said, don't let Ben be an obituary, because he's still alive. At this moment, his hands are being tied, his ankles are being manacled, a hood is being placed right down there. And a state-sanctioned murder is going to take place.
Singapore rejected the Australian Prime Minister's call for clemency, but authorities did relax the rules so Nguyen's mother and brother could hold his hands one last time. An Australian newspaper wrote, "Nguyen Tong Van is no martyr. He was a convicted drug smuggler. But the dignity, courage and generosity with which he faced his execution became, in itself, a compelling argument against a mandatory penalty of death."